Defendant, would you please rise for the pronouncement of sentence?
Lori Vallow Daybell sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murders of two of her three children, 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan.
In the backyard of a quiet home in rural Idaho, FBI agents and local police began digging near a fence line, in a section of the property the family had always referred to as their pet cemetery. They were searching for two missing children, a 7-year-old boy and his 16-year-old sister, gone for nearly 9 months at that point, and quietly, almost impossibly, still unaccounted for despite a nationwide search. What they found that day would confirm the worst fears of an entire country that had been following this case for months. But to truly understand how two children ended up buried in a backyard by the people who were supposed to love them most, you have to go back further, to a marriage that once looked completely ordinary, and a woman who slowly, methodically, convinced herself and the people around her that the end of the world was coming, and that anyone standing in her way had already become something less than human. Before we get into how this case unraveled, I want to ask you for something quick. Right now, more than 90% of the people watching this are not subscribed to this channel. If you want more cases like this one, hit that subscribe button, tap like on this video, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We are actively looking for true crime cases from viewers' own hometowns, so let us know where you are and we may end up covering a case near you. Now, let's go back to where this story actually begins. In 2006, Lori Vallow married a businessman named Charles Vallow. By all accounts from friends who knew the couple, it looked, at least in the early years, like a genuinely happy marriage. Together, they raised Tylee Ryan, Lori's daughter from a previous relationship. In 2014, the family grew again when Lori and Charles adopted a young boy named Joshua, who everyone called JJ. JJ was actually Charles's great-nephew by blood, the grandson of Charles's sister, and he had autism. Friends of Lori's, including a woman named April Raymond, described her as a patient, devoted mother to JJ, someone who seemed genuinely suited to caring for a child with his particular needs. Another family friend, Vasia Idaho, who knew the Vallows when they lived in Arizona, said Tylee embraced her role as a big sister so completely that she would jokingly refer to JJ as her own child. For years, this was simply the shape of Lori Vallow's life. A husband, 2 children she clearly loved, a household that, from the outside, looked stable. That started to change around 2017. Relatives later told investigators that Lori's relationship with her own children began shifting noticeably around that time. Friends pointed to something specific driving that change. Lori had begun reading the books of an author named Chad Daybell, a man who lived outside Rexburg, Idaho, and wrote fiction centered on doomsday prophecy and preparing for the end of the world. In 2018, Lori Vallow actually met Chad Daybell in person. According to friends, there was an immediate connection between the two of them, and they began recording religious podcasts together. Chad was married at the time to a woman named Tammy Daybell, and together they were raising 5 children of their own. What began, on the surface, as a shared interest in religious and doomsday content curdled, according to people close to Lori, into something far darker. Melanie Gibb, one of Lori's friends, later told investigators she had overheard Chad and Lori discussing something they called zombies, a term they used to describe people whose souls had supposedly been replaced by dark spirits. Another friend, April Raymond, said that around this time, Lori started referring to her own husband, Charles Vallow, using a single word, a demon. By 2019, Charles Vallow had become seriously alarmed by what he was witnessing in his wife. He went to police with his concerns, telling them Lori genuinely believed she was some kind of god, actively preparing for the end of days. He also told officers something even more disturbing. Lori, he said, had threatened to kill him. That February, Charles filed for divorce. In the court documents tied to that filing, he stated plainly that he feared for both his own safety and the safety of the children. Then in July of 2019, the situation exploded into violence. Charles went to the house in Chandler, Arizona, where Lori was living with the children, intending to pick up JJ and take him to school. Inside that home, Charles Vallow was shot and killed by Lori's own brother, Alex Cox. Cox told police afterward that Charles and Lori had gotten into a fight, and that he had shot Charles in self-defense to protect his sister. Both Lori and Tylee, who each claimed to have heard the shooting take place, gave police accounts that echoed Cox's version of events, describing it as an act of self-defense. With Charles gone, Lori's life reorganized itself quickly around Chad Daybell. That September, she relocated with her children to Rexburg, Idaho, moving closer to him. Her brother Alex Cox moved into the very same apartment complex. On September 8, 2019, Lori, Tylee, JJ, and Alex Cox took a trip together to Yellowstone National Park. That day would later take on enormous significance, because the photo taken there became the last known image of Tylee Ryan before she disappeared entirely. Around this same period, Melanie Gibb said she had heard Lori refer to her own daughter, Tylee, using that same chilling word she'd used for others: a zombie. The very next morning, September 9th, investigators later determined that Alex Cox's cell phone GPS placed him in Chad Daybell's backyard for roughly 2 hours. About 14 minutes after Cox's phone showed him leaving that property, Chad texted his wife Tammy a message that would become one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the entire case. He wrote that he had spotted a large raccoon along the fence, grabbed his gun, and shot it once, close enough that a single shot finished the job. The raccoon, he told her, was now buried in their pet cemetery. 2 weeks later, on September 22, 2019, JJ Vallow was seen for the last time. Melanie Gibb and her boyfriend, David Warwick, happened to be staying with Lori in Rexburg that same weekend. According to Warwick, he watched Alex Cox carry JJ into Lori's apartment that night. The next morning, when he asked to see the boy, Lori reportedly told them JJ was being a zombie and that Cox had needed to take him away. The following day, September 23rd, cell phone records showed Alex Cox had returned once again to Chad Daybell's backyard, this time for only 17 minutes. 2 children, gone within 2 weeks of each other, and the adults responsible for them said almost nothing. Then on October 19, 2019, tragedy struck a second family entirely. Chad Daybell's wife, Tammy, died. Their son, Garth Daybell, later said Tammy passed away in bed, and that he and his father were the ones who called 911. According to Daybell's children, who spoke publicly years later, the family declined to request an autopsy, believing the coroner's explanation that her death appeared to be from natural causes, especially given that Tammy had reportedly been in poor health beforehand. Roughly 2 weeks after Tammy's death, on November 5, 2019, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell got married on a beach in Hawaii. That same month, JJ's grandmother, Kay Woodcock, grew increasingly worried. She hadn't heard from her grandson in months, and she asked police to check on his welfare. On November 26, 2019, Rexburg police showed up at Lori Vallow Daybell's home looking for JJ. According to police, Lori lied to them outright, claiming JJ was safe and staying with her friend Melanie Gibb, back in Arizona. Gibb, when contacted, wasn't immediately forthcoming, but eventually called police herself to clarify that JJ had never actually been with her at all. As officers worked to locate JJ, they realized his older sister Tylee was missing too. What had started as a welfare check exploded into a nationwide search for both children. While that search was underway, while volunteers and law enforcement combed the country for 2 missing kids, Lori and Chad Daybell traveled back to Hawaii. That December, Fremont County investigators, growing increasingly suspicious about the circumstances surrounding Tammy Daybell's death, obtained the authority to exhume her body for a proper autopsy. That same month, Lori's brother Alex Cox, the man who had shot Charles Vallow and whose cell phone had placed him at Chad Daybell's property both mornings after each child vanished, died in Arizona. His death was ruled natural causes. In January of 2020, authorities formally ordered Lori to produce her children. She didn't comply. On February 20th, 2020, Lori Vallow Daybell was arrested in Hawaii. 2 weeks later, she was extradited back to Idaho to face the mounting investigation. Even after her arrest, neither Lori nor Chad revealed where the children actually were. On June 9, 2020, the FBI, Rexburg Police, and the Fremont County Sheriff's Office descended on Chad Daybell's property in Idaho. Investigators focused their search specifically on the areas where Alex Cox's cell phone had pinged back in September of the previous year. What they found, buried in shallow graves, ended any remaining uncertainty about what had happened to Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow. J.J. had been buried beneath a tree. About 50 yards away, in the exact area investigators recognized from Chad's pet cemetery text message, they found Tylee's grave. Investigators dug through that section of the pet cemetery and found no raccoon. Daybell's own children would later tell reporters that there was actually a second pet cemetery elsewhere on the property that investigators never searched, raising questions the family felt were never fully resolved. Chad Daybell was arrested that same day. Authorities later formally confirmed the remains belonged to J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan, and a memorial was eventually built along the fence line of the property to honor them. In May of 2021, both Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow Daybell were formally charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of J.J. and Tylee. Chad was additionally charged with murdering his first wife, Tammy. He pleaded not guilty to everything. That same June, Lori was also charged separately with conspiring to murder Charles Vallow, her husband who had been shot by her brother back in 2019. But before any of these cases could move to trial, a judge ruled that Lori was not mentally competent to stand trial and ordered her into mental health treatment. Her case was placed on hold. It wasn't until April of 2022, nearly a year later, that a judge determined Lori Vallow Daybell was finally mentally competent to proceed. When she was formally arraigned that April, she refused to enter a plea at all, so the judge entered a not guilty plea on her behalf. By May of 2022, prosecutors made clear that Lori would be eligible for the death penalty if convicted, arguing the killings had been carried out in an exceptionally depraved manner and motivated by financial gain. Chad Daybell's attorneys eventually succeeded in having the two trials severed, meaning Lori and Chad would be tried separately rather than together. In March of 2023, just weeks before Lori's trial was set to begin, her defense team successfully argued that the death penalty should be taken off the table specifically for her case, citing the sheer volume of evidence recently turned over that they hadn't had adequate time to review. The judge agreed. The death penalty remained on the table for Chad's separate trial. Lori Vallow Daybell's trial began on April 3, 2023, in Boise, Idaho. Jury selection alone was an enormous undertaking, with 1,800 potential jurors summoned and required to fill out a 20-page questionnaire before the court finally seated 12 jurors and 6 alternates. Opening statements began on April 10th. On May 12, 2023, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all charges. Lori Vallow Daybell was convicted of murdering Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow, conspiring to murder both of her own children, conspiring in the death of Tammy Daybell, and stealing Social Security payments that had been issued for the children she'd already had killed. At her sentencing on July 31, 2023, Judge Stephen Boyce handed down the maximum possible penalty, life in prison without the possibility of parole, for the murder and conspiracy charges, along with an additional 10-year sentence for grand theft and more than $50,000 in fines, civil penalties, and restitution. Before delivering that sentence, Judge Boyce addressed Lori directly in the courtroom. She had so many other options, he told her. She could have gotten a divorce. She could have found someone else to help care for the children. Instead, as the state had proven at trial, she chose what he called the most evil and destructive path possible. He went on to say that she had justified all of it by descending into what he described as a bizarre religious rabbit hole, one she clearly, in his view, remained trapped inside even as he sentenced her. That wasn't the end of Lori Vallow Daybell's legal reckoning. In December of 2023, she was formally charged with conspiracy to commit murder in the 2019 death of Charles Vallow, her husband who had been shot by her brother Alex Cox. She and Cox, before his own death, were also accused of conspiring to murder her niece's ex-husband, Brandon Boudreaux, who had actually been shot at while driving near his home back in 2019, though he survived unharmed. She pleaded not guilty to both new charges. Meanwhile, Chad Daybell's own trial finally moved forward. On May 30th, 2024, he was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of his first wife Tammy, and of J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan, along with conspiracy charges and insurance fraud tied to the case. On June 1st, 2024, he was sentenced to death. Lori's saga in Arizona, tied specifically to Charles Vallow's killing, moved to trial in the spring of 2025. Remarkably, despite having no legal training, Lori chose to represent herself in that Phoenix courtroom. On April 22, 2025, the jury convicted her of conspiracy to commit murder in Charles's death. She now faced yet another life sentence, on top of the one she was already serving in Idaho. Finally, on July 25, 2025, Lori Vallow Daybell was formally sentenced to life in prison on 2 separate murder conspiracy convictions out of Arizona, covering both Charles Vallow's death and the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. It marked, after years of overlapping trials across 2 states, something close to the true legal end of her story. A woman who had once been an ordinary wife and mother was now serving multiple life sentences in Idaho for murdering her own children and conspiring in the death of her husband's first wife, plus additional life sentences out of Arizona for conspiring to kill her estranged husband and attempting to kill a relative by marriage. What makes the Lori Vallow Daybell case so uniquely disturbing isn't just the number of deaths connected to her. Though 5 people lost their lives across the full span of this saga, Charles Vallow, Tammy Daybell, J.J. Vallow, Tylee Ryan, and eventually Alex Cox himself. It's the specific language she used to justify it all, the idea that people she once loved had somehow stopped being fully human, that they had become zombies or demons or vessels for dark spirits, language that allowed her, according to prosecutors, to rationalize eliminating anyone who stood between her and the doomsday future she and Chad Daybell believed they were building together. It's a case that shows, in the starkest terms imaginable, how quickly an ordinary family can unravel when religious belief curdles into something used not to explain the world, but to justify destroying the people in it. If this case moved you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Give this video a like, drop a comment letting us know your thoughts, and share it with anyone who appreciates real true crime stories told the right way.